It happened on a Tuesday, not a dramatic day, no thunderclap, no final argument, no suitcase thrown onto the lawn. Just a quiet afternoon, the kind that feels forgettable until it detonates your life. I was sitting at my desk, halfway through my third virtual meeting of the day, the scent of fresh coffee still lingering in the air, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen expecting a grocery reminder or maybe a check-in from my assistant. Instead, I saw 6 words that ripped through me with surgical precision. I'm filing for divorce. It's done. No greeting, no explanation, no warning. Just that. I froze. At first, I thought it was some sick joke, a botched message meant for someone else, a weird prank. But then came the second message, seconds later, like the exhale after a gunshot. I've moved out. I need space. Please don't call. 12 years. 12 years of marriage, of building a life, of surviving job changes, fertility treatments, 1 miscarriage, a mortgage, 2 dogs, and endless promises that we were a team. And this was how he ended it, by text. It felt like the floor fell out beneath me and I was still sitting there, smiling through a video call about project updates while my marriage crumbled in my pocket. I excused myself, logged off with some fumbling lie about internet issues, walked into the kitchen and sat on the cold tile, hands shaking, breath caught somewhere between a scream and a sob. I didn't cry, not at first. Instead, I opened the banking app. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Something cold and primal in me, already sensing that this wasn't just emotional betrayal, it was logistical, tactical, planned. And there it was, our joint account, the one we used for everything, bills, groceries, savings, emergencies, was empty. Not low, not drained, wiped, clean. $78,304.27 gone. Every dollar I had contributed for years. Every bit of security I had clung to while he told me to just trust his financial decisions. I refreshed the app once, twice. Checked our savings. 0. Checked the brokerage account. 0. Credit cards? All still in my name, but with new charges pending. One in Miami, another in San Diego. He wasn't just gone, he had vanished and taken everything with him. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't abandonment, it was extraction. My husband hadn't just left me, he'd executed an exit strategy he had been engineering for months, probably longer, and I'd never seen it coming. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly anticipate, was that he'd just made the last mistake of his life. Because I'd built empires before he ever knew how to spell investment. Because I knew systems, patterns, and legal mechanisms he never bothered to understand. Because while he was draining our account and fleeing like a coward in the night, I was already cataloging everything he'd overlooked. I wasn't going to chase him, I was going to destroy him. They say hindsight is crueler than betrayal, and I believe that. Because once the shock settled, once my pulse returned to something resembling a rhythm, all the signs I'd ignored began crashing down around me like broken glass. His late nights, the sudden business trips to cities we had no ties to, the locked drawers in his home office I once chalked up to privacy, the way he started changing his passwords for security, even though we shared everything, or so I thought. I spent that first night in a trance, walking through our home like I was touring someone else's life. Our wedding photos still hung on the hallway wall. His shoes were gone, but the indentation in the entryway bench remained. One of his colognes was still on the bathroom shelf, half-used, mocking me with its scent. But the safe in the closet was empty. His files, his personal laptop, even the emergency cash we kept just in case, all gone. He'd done this with calculation, with detail, like a man checking boxes on a punch list. Step 1. Remove valuables. Step 2. Drain accounts. Step 3. Send a message. Step 4. Disappear. And the cruelest part? He had smiled through all of it. Just the weekend before, we'd gone out to dinner with another couple, our neighbors. He poured my wine for me, placed a hand on my back, laughed at my stories. He even kissed my temple when I brought up adopting another dog after the holidays. I'd fallen asleep that night with my head on his chest, believing we were building something, believing that all the struggles, the infertility, the loss, the endless climbing, were worth it because we still had us. But there was no us. There had never been an us to him. There was only what I could provide, what I could fund. I worked in operations and compliance for a national retail chain. I'd been the first in my family to earn an MBA. I was the one who knew how to stretch money into investment portfolios. The one who refinanced our mortgage when rates dipped, who negotiated better insurance, who built our household budget down to the cent. He'd always deferred to me financially, or so it seemed. But now I understood why. Letting me build the foundation meant he could gut it when I wasn't looking. It wasn't just betrayal. It was predation. And that changed everything. because in that moment, sitting on the edge of our bed, my bed now, in a house he had effectively looted, I made a decision. I wouldn't be the woman people pitied. I wouldn't be the whispered story passed around yoga classes and wine nights. Did you hear what happened to Afa? Her husband left her by text and took all their money. No, I would be the story people feared. So I made a list. Not just of what he took, but of everything he underestimated. He thought he was the clever one because he moved money into hidden accounts. I had colleagues in banking compliance who owed me favors. He thought he could run up charges on credit lines in my name. I knew how to file a fraud report that would freeze his spending in under 24 hours. He thought he could disappear into some sunny coastal city with a fake narrative and a clean break. He'd forgotten who taught him how to survive in the first place. I had built him, and now I was going to take him apart. Not with threats, not with tears, but with perfectly executed precision, the kind that leaves no fingerprints but delivers full devastation. Because he didn't just leave me, he declared war, and I was going to respond like every underestimated woman before me, with silence, strategy, and a storm he'd never see coming. By sunrise, I was no longer a wife in mourning. I was a tactician assembling her arsenal. I hadn't slept. I didn't need to. The adrenaline had replaced sleep, hunger, even fear. While most people were still in their pajamas scrolling through morning headlines, I was drafting a detailed action plan, not for reconciliation, not for closure, for destruction, legal, financial, reputational. And every move I made from that point forward was calculated with the discipline of a woman who knew exactly how much had been stolen from her. Step 1. Freeze what remained. Rick had moved fast, but not fast enough. Our joint accounts were empty, yes, but I had access to accounts under my name only. Accounts he'd long forgotten about or dismissed as trivial. My emergency high-yield savings. A credit card I'd opened when we first got married and never closed. A brokerage portfolio my grandmother left me in her will, one I never discussed because he always said we had more urgent priorities than managing old family money. Together, they gave me enough to operate with strength and, more importantly, without panic. I used those funds immediately. First, I retained a forensic accountant, Arlene Cho, a sharp, unsentimental woman with a specialty in asset tracing. She'd once audited multinational corporations for hidden losses. Now she was turning her full attention to my soon-to-be ex-husband. Then I retained legal counsel. Not a generalist, not a cheap local option. I went straight to a woman named Sloane Becker, the kind of divorce attorney who specialized in asset concealment and had a reputation for unearthing shell corporations and unraveling financial lies like it was an Olympic sport. She'd made 3 men cry in court in the last year alone, not by shouting, but by calmly dismantling every illusion they thought they'd built. When I laid out my situation, Sloane didn't blink. He planned this, I told her. He waited until I was neck-deep in work and emotionally stable, then pulled the plug with no warning. She tapped her pen once against the folder. Men like this always assume that emotional shock will buy them a head start, but if he's touched anything traceable in the last 30 days, we'll find it, then we'll bury him with it. She smiled. Now we're speaking the same language. By the end of the day, we'd filed an emergency motion to begin discovery. We requested a court order to subpoena his financials, filed notices to banks, issued a fraud complaint for the cards used after his disappearance. Arlene had already begun scanning the last 6 months of account activity for anomalies. Patterns emerged quickly. Rick had transferred money in smaller, repeated amounts over several weeks, likely hoping I wouldn't notice. Classic tactic, floppy, but that wasn't the only mistake he made. Step 2. Intelligence. I didn't need to hire a private investigator to find Rick. Not yet. I didn't have to. Rick was predictable in all the worst ways. He always thought of himself as clever, but like most men who relied on charm to navigate the world, he was lazy underneath the surface. He'd always talked about Florida, Palm Beach, Naples, Gulf Coast life. He'd romanticized it for years, especially during the cold months, saying we'd retire there someday, that he wanted sand in his shoes and no more deadlines. I hadn't paid attention at the time. But now, those throwaway comments became coordinates. He wouldn't have gone far, not yet, and definitely not to a place where he had no contacts. So I started small. I called his former assistant, Kara, a bright, undervalued woman he constantly belittled for her overthinking. I knew she liked me. I also knew she was 2 weeks into a new job and no longer under any NDA. I called under the guise of needing help with a tech login he'd once handled for our joint taxes. She hesitated, then sighed. He had the company laptop shipped to a Florida address. Coconut Grove. Private mailbox. That's all I know. It was enough. Within 12 hours, Arlene had a lead on 3 property rental records in that area, one of which had been paid in full 2 weeks prior, under a business name I'd never seen before. A shell corporation with a P.O. box and a bank account opened using a joint mailing address we both shared. He'd used my name, my address, my marriage to legitimize his exit strategy, and now it was evidence. By that night, Sloan was already preparing an emergency motion to freeze that account, and I'd reached out to the local jurisdiction's clerk to preemptively flag any major financial movements tied to it. Quiet, legal, devastating. But I wasn't finished. Step 3. Exposure. Rick had made a habit of cultivating his image. On social media, in business, in our circle of friends, he was the affable husband, the responsible investor, the guy who hosted dinner parties and offered unsolicited advice on financial literacy to anyone who'd listen. I had built half of that image for him, standing next to him like a certificate of trust. Now I would take it apart, brick by brick. I didn't rant. I didn't scream. I simply told the truth. I met for coffee with mutual friends, not all of them, just the ones who mattered. I told them what he'd done. I showed them proof, the text, the account statements, the receipts. I didn't ask for sympathy. I wasn't recruiting allies. I was setting the record straight. And the moment I saw the shift in their eyes, the moment his betrayal clicked into their understanding, I knew the legend of Rick, the stable, trustworthy husband, was cracking. He'd left me by text and emptied our life. But in doing so, he'd underestimated the one thing that would become his undoing. Me. The call came from Arlene 3 days later, and I'll never forget the sound of her voice. Low, measured, laced with the kind of satisfaction only professionals feel when they've caught a predator in his own trap. "We found her," she said. I didn't need to ask who. The woman Rick had siphoned our life into, the inevitable affair, the shadow behind the shell accounts, and the $1,000 dinner charges in cities I'd never visited. She wasn't just real. She had a name, a face, and a paper trail. Arlene had cross-referenced the Airbnb transaction used for a luxury coastal property in Naples, Florida with Rick Shell Corporation, and uncovered another name tied to the payment. Delilah Ray Milton, 34, recently divorced, and until 4 months ago, employed as an interior design consultant for a boutique firm in Chicago. The dots connected easily. He met her during a commercial renovation project. She was younger, blonder, and by the look of her Instagram, which I viewed through a burner account in full composure, deeply in love with the man she called Jay. Jay, for Jonathan, Rick's full first name. A name almost no one used except on legal paperwork. The fact that she knew him by it told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just cheating. He was reinventing himself. He was building a new life from stolen wood, using the story of our marriage as foundation. Delilah's post told a tale he could never have fabricated himself. There were photos of the two of them on a boat, her hand on his chest, matching champagne flutes at a beachfront brunch. One of them holding keys in front of a townhouse with the caption "Our next chapter." She had no idea that everything he was giving her, the lifestyle, the comfort, the apparent security, had been ripped directly from the life we'd spent over a decade building. My income, my planning, my discipline, my name. The fury I felt wasn't even personal anymore. It was territorial. Like a woman whose work had been stolen and republished under a new author. I showed the photos to Sloan. "Can we use this?" She nodded. "Not only can we use it, we will. This proves dissipation of marital assets. He's funding another life with marital money before legal separation. This puts us in perfect position to file for injunctive relief and punitive recovery. In short, we could legally dismantle his fantasy before it fully formed." That afternoon, Sloan filed a motion to freeze all assets linked to the Shell Corporation and seize access to any property purchased using joint marital funds. Arlene sent documentation to Delilah's employer confirming her indirect entanglement in a financial misconduct case. Quietly, neutrally, just enough to create pressure. The next day, Rick finally broke silence. He called. Locked number. His voice hoarse. That same falsely calm tone he used when he knew he'd been caught, but hadn't yet figured out how deep the damage ran. "I think we need to talk," he said, skipping past pretense. "I think you need a lawyer who knows how to play chess," I replied. "Because I'm 5 moves in and you're already cornered." Silence. Then, "You've always been like this." Cold. Calculating. "No," I said. "I just stopped being sentimental about the man who gutted our life like a thief in the night." He tried again, fumbling toward some version of reconciliation. Not with love, with damage control. He asked if we could settle quietly, avoid airing things out. Said it wasn't healthy for Emily, our niece, whom we'd raised like a daughter, to see this kind of hostility. I let him finish his script. Then I spoke clearly. "You ended our marriage with a text message. You emptied our accounts like a criminal. You stole my money, my security, and my trust, and used them to play house with a woman you barely know. You don't get to ask for discretion now." He hung up before I finished. It was the closest he'd ever come to begging. That evening, Arlene sent over the confirmation. We located the offshore account where Rick had moved the bulk of our funds, over $42,000 transferred into a Bahamian-based entity registered to yet another shell name, Blue Coral Holdings. But it was sloppily filed. One of the wire transfers still carried the last 4 digits of our joint U.S. bank account. We had him. The paper trail was undeniable, the fraud traceable, the betrayal complete. And I wasn't finished. Because while Sloan prepared for the court to rule on seizure of funds and Delilah's world began to shake, I was already planning the next phase, to make sure Rick couldn't slither back into our world, not as a man, not as a name, not as a rumor of sympathy. I would ensure the legal fire burned so hot and so clean that there wouldn't be a single inch of life left for him to return to. He thought divorcing me by text would spare him confrontation. What he didn't realize was that it only delayed his execution. And now I was just getting started. Once Rick knew I was coming for him, he did what men like him always do when their backs hit the wall. He got sloppy. Not because he panicked, but because deep down he still believed he could outmaneuver me. That same arrogance he wore throughout our marriage now became his most fatal flaw. He thought because he'd surprised me once, he could keep control. But he didn't understand. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was building. The court granted our emergency motion within 5 days. Every account connected to Blue Coral Holdings was frozen. The townhouse Rick had leased in Naples, the one he planned to fill with sunsets and Delilah's fake laugh furniture showroom aesthetic, was suddenly flagged in a legal dispute over marital fraud. The landlord was notified. The utilities? Disconnected. The credit cards? Declined. He called again, twice. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned my attention to what mattered most, full strategic dominance. I started with a narrative. In every betrayal, there are 2 versions of the story, the one the coward tells, and the one the survivor carves into stone. Rick had always leaned on his charisma. He was a man who could pitch trust like a salesman at a Sunday revival. In our social circle, he had been the balanced one, the guy who remembered birthdays and brought wine to dinner parties and pretended like he adored my ambition. And people had bought it. For years, they saw our marriage as stable, maybe even enviable. But he didn't know how fast perception could shift when the right details were shared. I made no public declarations. No long social media post, no dramatic retelling. I simply began to live as if I had nothing to hide, because I didn't. I went to events, showed up for community panels, attended a friend's gallery opening, and when people asked, I answered simply, truthfully. Rick left by text and drained our joint account. I've initiated a full recovery. They blinked. Some looked uncomfortable. Others nodded too sharply, already doing the math behind their eyes. I saw the shift in real time, the moment they recalculated the man they thought they knew. And I let it happen. People talk? Always. I didn't have to destroy his reputation. I just had to stop protecting it. While I rebuilt my presence socially, Sloan and Arlene escalated the legal pressure. Rick was now required to provide full financial disclosure. Every transfer, every asset, every shell. He missed the first deadline. His attorney filed for a continuance, citing emotional duress and unexpected travel delays. Sloan shredded that excuse with timestamps and GPS data that showed him attending a private beach event with Delilah the same weekend. The judge wasn't amused. Not only was the continuance denied, but we were awarded additional legal costs due to non-compliance. Every deflection Rick attempted now carried a price tag, a brilliant tactic Sloan called strategic erosion. You don't have to land the knockout, she told me one evening over a case update. You just keep letting the pressure crush his position until he caves under his own lies. And that pressure was working. Delilah had deactivated her Instagram. Rick's LinkedIn changed status from managing partner to nothing. His business registrations began dissolving one by one as financial inquiries poured in. He'd spent years weaving the illusion of stability. In less than a month, I had reduced it to threads. And still, I wasn't finished. There was one more front, the one he thought I wouldn't dare touch. His parents. For years, Rick had leaned on the illusion of filial devotion, always sending birthday cards, calling every Sunday. He made himself the favorite son while quietly belittling his sister's divorce and minimizing his brother's setbacks. But what his parents didn't know, and what I had always protected them from, was how little Rick respected them behind closed doors. He once told me, "They're good for appearances, that's all. It's an investment." So I decided to collect the return. I invited them to lunch. Just me, no explanations over text, no passive-aggressive pretense. Just a quiet table in the same bistro they liked to take us to on our anniversaries. They came, hesitant, but curious, and I told them everything. I showed them the texts, the bank records, the timeline. The house in Florida. I told them calmly that I was not asking for loyalty, only honesty, that I wanted them to understand why things were about to get loud, and that whatever story Rick fed them, I was giving them the truth first. His mother cried. His father clenched his jaw and muttered, "Unbelievable." I left them there with the folder and walked out without a word. That move wasn't about vengeance. It was about legacy. Rick had tried to erase me from my own life, financially, emotionally, narratively. He wanted to rewrite our history with a new woman, a new location, a new version of himself. But I refused to be edited out. He thought the text message was the end, but it was the spark. And now the fire was spreading through his money, through his social circle, through the very identity he built atop my labor. And when the last plank collapsed beneath him, I wouldn't scream. I'd just closed the door behind him. The courthouse hearing that changed everything didn't start with a bang. It began with Rick showing up 10 minutes late, wearing a crumpled linen blazer he probably thought said relaxed and unaffected, but to everyone else in the room, he just looked unprepared and desperate. His lawyer carried a satchel filled with last-minute exhibits, but even from my seat, I could see the unease behind the man's polished facade. Sloane, by contrast, sat beside me calm and perfectly still, flipping through our well-organized file like she was reviewing a dinner menu. This hearing wasn't for the divorce itself. That would come later. Today was about control. Financial control, property control. The court had already seen the evidence of asset dissipation. This hearing was to determine whether I would be granted a temporary financial restraining order and preliminary exclusive use of our remaining liquid assets and marital property. In short, we were asking the court to strip Rick of access to everything he hadn't already stolen. And we came armed. Sloane began with a surgical opening, a full timeline of the financial deception, supported by Arlene's airtight audit trail. She highlighted how, in the 3 months prior to filing for divorce, Rick had moved tens of thousands of dollars from joint accounts to private accounts using fictitious business names. She cited the Florida address, the fake corporation, the transactions using marital funds that paid for another woman's housing and lifestyle. Then came the receipts, literal ones, scans of hotel bills, luxury dining, boutique furniture, rideshare trips, all dated, geotagged, matched to the timeline of my work trips or late-night meetings when he knew I wouldn't be home or looking. Then, finally, Sloane dropped the bomb, a sworn affidavit from Delilah's former coworker, a quiet but damning statement that confirmed Rick had introduced himself as newly divorced and financially independent, that he was planning to invest in design partnerships with her, that he had referred to our marriage as a tax complication that would resolve itself quietly. The judge sat silently through it all, only interrupting once to ask Rick's counsel to speak up when he tried to object mid-sentence. But it didn't matter. Every attempt they made to soften the facts was immediately countered by concrete evidence, tax filings, audio transcripts, a digital trail of everything Rick assumed he'd buried. When it was Rick's turn to speak, he shifted into a performance I'd seen before, the polished charm, the faux humility, the shoulder slouch that always suggested he was trying his best. He called me emotional, said I had twisted everything, that we had grown apart, and that this financial confusion was simply a misunderstanding from the transition period. Then he said the phrase that sealed his fate. I didn't think she'd react this way. The judge looked at him for a long moment before leaning forward. So let me understand. You emptied joint assets, misrepresented your marital status, created a false corporate entity using shared property records, and began funding a secondary residence. And you're surprised that your wife chose to protect herself? Rick went silent. The judge signed every motion, every single one. From that moment forward, he could no longer access any accounts, investment vehicles, or credit lines tied to me or our former shared entities. He was removed from the deed to our primary residence, pending property division. All remaining assets were frozen and placed under court supervision, and most critically, the judge ordered him to pay my legal fees in full as restitution for fraudulent spending. It was financial asphyxiation. I walked out of that courtroom without looking back. Sloane placed the stamped documents in my hands, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of the fight shift entirely in my direction. But the war wasn't just about what I could prove in court. There was still one battlefield left, reputation. Because while the legal gears turned in my favor, Rick had begun to panic in public. He started contacting people, friends, colleagues, even some of my family, spinning a new version of the story. That I was vindictive, that I was dragging him through court because I couldn't handle rejection, that I was obsessed with control. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Instead, I hosted a fundraiser. Just a small gathering, a non-profit event I'd been quietly planning behind the scenes with one of our old philanthropic partners. Rick had always insisted on handling those connections. Now, I was taking them back. I invited our circle. I invited new connections. I invited people who'd heard whispers and wanted to see who was still standing. And I stood, in a black silk dress, smiling, composed, no sign of collapse. When people asked how I said, doing better than ever, actually. When they offered sympathy, I redirected. It was the cleanest break I could have asked for. I should have sent a thank you card. By the end of the night, 3 of his former clients had asked for my business card. Delilah, it turned out, had packed up and left Naples. Word was she found out more than she wanted to, that Rick's money wasn't really his, that the house wasn't really his, and that the woman he promised to leave behind wasn't just fighting back, she was winning. The lies were no longer sustainable. Rick was cornered, in court, in his social life, in the story he told himself about who he was and how this would play out. And the most poetic part? He still hadn't seen the final blow coming. But I had, because it was already in motion. By the time most people think a divorce has settled, what they really mean is that the fireworks are over. The shouting, the slammed doors, the performative grief. But the real dismantling? The slow, methodical erosion of a man's constructed world that happens quietly, long after the noise fades. Rick had no idea that the court ruling was only the beginning of what I had prepared for him. He thought his worst days were behind him. He was wrong. They hadn't even started. The financial destruction was nearly complete. His lines of credit were frozen, his accounts monitored by the court. The funds he tried to hide had either been seized or were in the process of being subpoenaed. Delilah was gone, not just from the townhouse but from the state. She'd left behind nothing but a few vague emails to Rick and a line about reevaluating everything. But I still had one final goal: obliteration of his influence. That meant removing him not just from my life, but from every structure he had built using my name, my trust, and my labor. And the next battlefield was professional. He'd spent years padding his reputation as a financial advisor, a self-made strategist, he called himself, conveniently omitting the fact that I had created his first business plan, organized his first licensing paperwork, and used my own credit to get his first round of startup capital. In short, I'd built the scaffolding, and he stood on top pretending to touch the stars. Now I was going to shake the foundation until it collapsed. Through Sloan's team, we filed formal reports to the regulatory board that oversaw Rick's financial licenses. It wasn't difficult. His misuse of funds wasn't just a marital offense. It bordered on professional malpractice. He'd used personal and business accounts interchangeably, failed to disclose personal conflicts of interest, and misrepresented his status to business partners and clients. Every transaction Delilah had benefited from using client-tied revenue was another nail in his career's coffin. The board responded fast. Within a week, they issued a formal inquiry. His license was placed under review, a euphemism for "we're coming for your livelihood." Then I went after the consulting firm he had tried to partner with post-resignation. Rick had once bragged about signing a quiet advisory contract with a boutique investment group. No office, all virtual, low visibility, high return. He thought it made him immune to scandal. But I knew where the cracks were. I sent an anonymous tip, attached the financial documents, sent a link to the court ruling. They dropped him by email within 48 hours. That same week, his professional website vanished from search results. No contact form, no press. His social media pages were deactivated. He was erasing himself pixel by pixel, not out of shame, but in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. But the blood was already in the water. Then came the blow I knew would hurt most. I'd kept in contact with his sister Camille, the one he had always treated like an inconvenience. She had never liked Rick's sanctimony, but stayed quiet for the sake of peace. I'd once comforted her through her divorce, stood by her when their parents blamed her for quitting too soon. She remembered. So when I reached out, not as a strategist, but as a woman betrayed, she listened. And she offered something Rick had never seen coming: the family's silent blessing to tell the truth. Because even they were tired of protecting a man who burned every bridge the moment he could no longer use it for leverage. Camille wrote a letter, not to him, but to the board, to the judge, and eventually to a local publication that ran a piece titled "The Man Who Walked Away: Divorce, Deceit, and the Illusion of Control." She didn't name names. She didn't have to. But it spread like wildfire through the financial community. Within a week, 3 local forums were discussing a known advisor whose empire was imploding under fraud and ego. My name wasn't mentioned, but the right people knew. Rick had spent years building a version of himself that didn't exist. I had spent months quietly collecting every lie he told and turning them into proof. And now, there was nothing left to hide behind. He called again. I let it ring. He emailed. I archived it. He sent a letter. I handed it directly to Sloan, because I had no interest in his apologies. I didn't want closure. I wanted consequences. and I had delivered them. The final blow came not with fire or fury, but with paper. After months of forensic accounting, legal warfare, and strategic silence, the final stage of Rick's destruction arrived in the form of a thick envelope stamped with state insignia, delivered directly to his lawyer's office and to the registered address of his Florida townhouse, which, by then, he no longer occupied. Forwarded mail, a failed fantasy, a man running out of places to hide. Inside that envelope was a court-ordered notice of civil action, a separate, full-scale lawsuit, spearheaded not by me, but by two of his former clients. Because while I'd been cleaning out the wreckage of our marriage, Sloane's investigation had uncovered something much darker. Rick hadn't just stolen from me. He'd misused client assets, real people's retirement accounts, laundering small percentages through his shell companies to cover personal expenses while making minor profits appear like investment returns. To the untrained eye, it looked like fluctuation. To a licensed forensic team, it was theft. And now the people he once called portfolio partners were coming for him with the full force of civil liability. One had already contacted a federal investigator. The other had retained counsel to seek damages. Both had documentation that mirrored mine. Both were furious. And I wasn't even the one leading the charge anymore. Rick had become a case file. He'd gone from being the charming man in tailored suits, smiling at dinner parties and talking about passive income, to a disgraced former advisor who couldn't open a checking account without a compliance hold. His accounts frozen, his credit shot, his licenses suspended, his social reputation annihilated, and now he faced the kind of lawsuits that stick to a man's name like rot. And as it all collapsed, I watched from a distance, not with vengeance in my heart, but with clarity in my mind, because while his empire crumbled, I was rebuilding mine. I sold the house we once shared, not out of necessity, but by choice. Every room had been cleared, repainted, redefined, but I no longer needed to inhabit the shell of the life he'd infected. I bought a smaller home across town, modern, quiet, surrounded by trees and light. Paid in full, mine. Not a penny of it touched by him. I launched a consulting firm of my own, something I'd put off for years while supporting his ambitions. Now, it was my name on the branding, my strategies behind the success, and my story, unflinching and precise. That made people listen. The first time I told it publicly was at a women's finance summit. I didn't name Rick. I didn't need to. I stood in front of a packed room and said, when someone empties your bank account and tells you they're done, you have two choices: collapse or construct. I chose construction. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was long, because every woman in that room had touched some version of my story. Maybe not the exact betrayal, but the slow silencing, the theft of identity, the erasure. I had built a business from that rubble. I had turned survival into capital. And Rick? He had become what he feared most: irrelevant. No one in his old circles returned his calls. His own parents, after months of trying to see both sides, finally went silent. The last time I heard his name spoken aloud was by a banker who referred to him only as the guy who burned down his own future. I didn't hate him. I had outgrown him. Because revenge, in the end, wasn't just about what I took back. It was about what I built without him. The money, the reputation, the power. Those were just consequences. The real victory was this: I had returned to myself, unapologetically, unequivocally, and you would never, never be able to touch that again. There's a strange, almost sacred quiet that comes after the storm ends. Not the stillness of fear, not the numb silence of grief, but a kind of peace that hums beneath your skin. A low, steady pulse that tells you made it through, and not just intact, but changed, refined, hardened, and softened in all the right places. It had been a year since Rick's text detonated my life. 12 months since he vanished in the night with everything we built, thinking he'd buried me in the rubble. But I didn't stay buried. I stood, I rebuilt, and I rose higher than I'd ever been while carrying his weight. By the time our divorce was finalized, Rick had become a ghost. His financial fraud made it impossible for him to maintain employment in any reputable institution. His name triggered alerts in regulatory databases. His license was revoked. The civil suits filed by his former clients expanded into a formal investigation, the kind with subpoenas and IRS audits and whispered warnings. But none of that involved me anymore. I had closed that chapter not with revenge, but with results. I didn't attend the final court date. Sloane did that for me. Instead, I spent the morning walking through my new house barefoot, coffee in hand, windows open. The breeze carried in the sound of birds, the distant hum of traffic, and the sharp, brilliant silence of peace. There was no one to explain myself to anymore. No one to tiptoe around. No games to play. No roles to perform. For the first time in my adult life, I existed entirely for myself. My consulting firm had grown quickly, partly because I knew what I was doing, but mostly because I now understood why I was doing it. I wasn't trying to prove anything to a man. I wasn't chasing validation through sacrifice. I had stopped minimizing my worth to keep someone else comfortable, and the women who hired me saw that. They trusted it. They wanted to learn it. Every client I took on reminded me of who I used to be, and I treated them accordingly. Not with pity, but with strategy. I gave them the tools Rick once tried to dull in me: the clarity, the language, the map to their own power. One afternoon, after hosting a private seminar for women navigating career transitions post-divorce, a woman lingered after the others had gone. She looked me in the eye and said, "You don't speak like someone who is broken. You speak like someone who built the blueprint for what comes after." And I realized then, she was right. Rick had left thinking he burned me to the ground. But all he did was clear the land, and I had built a fortress where our house used to be. I didn't hear from Rick again after the settlement was finalized. No apology, no late-night plea, no sudden epiphany sent in the form of a long-winded email asking for forgiveness. Just silence, the kind that follows after the last domino falls and the dust refuses to rise. And that was fine, because I no longer needed words from him to validate what I had lived through. My life, in its new form, was evidence enough. I poured myself into the things that mattered. I joined a mentorship network for women rebuilding after financial abuse. I partnered with 2 nonprofits that offered legal support to spouses left without resources. And I kept showing up to panels, to workshops, to back rooms where women whispered, "You don't know me, but your story got me through mine." That was how I knew I'd won. Not just because Rick had fallen, but because I had risen and taken others with me. The home I now lived in wasn't large. It didn't need to be. It had clean lines, wide windows, and floors that glowed amber when the sun spilled across them at dusk. I filled it with my own colors. Books I actually wanted to read, art that made no apologies, plants that thrived because I had the time and energy to care for them now. There were no rooms I avoided, no scents that reminded me of deception, no drawers I was afraid to open. It was a space I built without compromise, a mirror of who I had become. One morning, while sipping coffee on the back deck, I received a letter in the mail. A plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from a state I no longer had ties to. I knew who it was from before I even opened it. Inside, a single page, typed and folded once. I made mistakes. I panicked. I thought I was doing what was best for me, and maybe I convinced myself it would hurt you less if I just left without confrontation. I was wrong. I lost everything, and I'm sorry. There was no name at the bottom. But there didn't need to be. I read it once, then I set it aside. Not because I was angry, but because I'd already written my answer, in the form of a life that no longer included him. The day I got that letter was the same day I signed the lease for my company's new office space. A small suite downtown, flooded with natural light. There would be room for a second desk, for the assistant I was finally ready to hire. There would be room for expansion, for hosting private sessions, for growth, for more. Because the story Rick thought he ended with a 6-word text had, in truth, just been my prologue. He pressed send thinking he'd locked a door, but what he didn't realize was that he'd opened 1,000 more. And not one of them led back to him. I walked through every one with my head held high. I wasn't just free, I was undeniable, and no one would ever take that from me again.